You believe barbers just cut hair, don't you? Of course you do. It's what civilization taught you to think. But tonight, while you sit comfortably in your sanitized world, I'm going to show you what really happened in those cramped medieval shops, where the scent of lavender mixed with the stench of gangrene. And when I'm finished, you'll never look at that red and white striped pole the same way again. Picture this. It's 1347, and you're walking through the cobblestone streets of London. Your tooth aches like the devil himself is gnawing at your jaw. Where do you go? To the same man who trimmed your beard yesterday. The same hands that carefully shaped your mustache are about to plunge into your mouth with iron pliers. No anesthesia, no sterility, just raw medieval brutality disguised as medicine. You see, my friend, the barber-surgeon wasn't just a professional, he was evolution's cruel joke on human suffering. These men lived in a world where the church forbade physicians from spilling blood, considering it beneath their scholarly dignity. So who filled this bloody gap? The neighborhood barber, already comfortable with sharp blades and human flesh. The transition from trimming hair to sawing bone was apparently seamless. Let me paint you a picture that will haunt your next haircut. Imagine walking into Giovanni's shop in 14th century Florence. The familiar smell of soap and oils hits you first, comforting and normal. But look closer. See those stains on his leather apron? That's not hair dye, my curious friend. Those brown-red splotches tell stories of desperate souls who came seeking relief and found something far more permanent. The tools hanging on Giovanni's wall would make a modern surgeon weep. Rusty saws that doubled as combs, scissors that served as surgical instruments, and razors sharp enough to shave a whisker or slice through a gangrenous limb with equal precision. Each tool carried the DNA of hundreds of previous patients, spreading disease like a medieval plague distribution network. But here's where it gets truly twisted. These barber-surgeons didn't just stumble into medicine, they embraced it with the enthusiasm of entrepreneurs discovering an untapped market. Why settle for a few coins from a haircut when you could charge a fortune for removing an arrow from a knight's chest? The profit margins on pain were simply too tempting to ignore. The red and white pole outside their shops wasn't just decoration, it was advertisement. Red for arterial blood, white for bandages, and that spiral? That represented the twisted path of blood flowing from a patient's arm during the popular bloodletting procedures. Every time you pass one today, you're looking at a medieval billboard for legalized torture. Now let's talk about their most popular service. Bloodletting. The theory was beautifully simple and absolutely insane. Sick? You have too much blood. Depressed? Too much blood. Pregnant? Definitely too much blood. The solution was always the same. Drain the patient until they either felt better or stopped complaining altogether. And guess who performed this life-saving service? Your friendly neighborhood barber, of course. The process was almost ritualistic in its horror. The patient would sit in a chair, often the same chair used for haircuts, while the barber selected his favorite vein. The tools were crude. A sharp knife called a fleam, or sometimes just a razor. No understanding of blood pressure, circulation, or the minor detail that humans actually need their blood to, live. But the barber-surgeons had developed an art form around suffering. They knew exactly how much blood to drain before a patient lost consciousness. They could gauge by skin color, by the strength of a pulse, by the coherence of speech. It was precision born from repetition, skill earned through countless bodies that never walked out of their shops. What fascinates me most is how they marketed this butchery. These weren't back-alley criminals. They were respected members of society. Guilds regulated their practices, apprentices learned their trade, and wealthy patrons sought their services. The barber-surgeon was simultaneously the most trusted and most dangerous person in any medieval community. Consider the psychological profile of someone who could seamlessly transition from grooming to surgery. What kind of mind finds equal satisfaction in perfecting a beard trim and performing an amputation? The answer is more disturbing than you might think. These were men who understood that flesh is just flesh. Whether it's growing from a scalp or rotting on a battlefield wound, the apprenticeship system was particularly cruel. Young boys, barely teenagers, would spend years learning to navigate the delicate balance between healing and killing. They practiced on pigs, on corpses when available, and eventually on desperate human beings who had nowhere else to turn. Imagine the psychological conditioning required to make a child comfortable with human suffering as a career choice. Their waiting rooms, if you could call them that, were theaters of horror disguised as normalcy. Patients would sit alongside customers getting haircuts. The casual conversation punctuated by screams from the back room where someone was having a limb removed without anesthesia. The mixing of mundane and macabre was so complete that people accepted it as natural order. The most chilling aspect? The barber-surgeons genuinely believed they were helping. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was sadism wrapped in the banner of medical progress. They saw themselves as healers, as necessary servants of human health. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions and medieval medical practices. But this story, it didn't die in some distant century. The next time you sit in a barber's chair, feeling that warm towel on your face, hearing the snip of scissors near your ear, remember Giovanni and his blood-stained apron, and realize how thin the line still is between care and harm, between healing and hurting. Because in the end, we're all just flesh and bone, trusting strangers with sharp objects near our most vulnerable places. The chair you're sitting in has older roots than you know, and some traditions never truly die. They just learn to hide their teeth. Now that you understand who these Barber-Surgeons were, let me show you what they actually did behind those innocent-looking shop doors. Because the real horror wasn't in their tools or their techniques, it was in their absolute certainty that they were saving lives while systematically destroying them. The year is 1423, and William the Barber-Surgeon of Canterbury has just received his most challenging case yet. A blacksmith's apprentice has arrived with his hand crushed by a hammer, bones protruding through flesh like broken ivory through torn leather. Modern medicine would rush him to an operating room, pump him full of morphine, and carefully reconstruct to each shattered bone. William's solution? A meat cleaver and a prayer. But here's what makes my blood run cold. William genuinely believed he was showing mercy. In his mind, amputation wasn't brutality, it was salvation. Better a living man with one hand than a dead man with two. The logic was sound, the execution was medieval butchery, and the patient's screams were just background music to another successful procedure. Let me describe William's amputation technique, because understanding the process reveals the true depths of medieval medical horror. First, he would tie a leather strap around the patient's upper arm, not for sterility, but to prevent them from thrashing too violently. Then came the cutting, performed with the same confidence he used to trim beards. No understanding of nerve endings, no concept of shock, just steady hands and an iron stomach. The smell in that room would haunt you forever. Picture the metallic tang of blood mixing with the acrid smoke from the red-hot iron used to cauterize the wound. Add the stench of burning flesh, the patient's vomit from the unbearable pain, and the underlying odor of infection that seemed to permeate everything. This was the perfume of medieval medicine. What's truly disturbing is how efficient they became at human disassembly. A skilled barber surgeon could remove a limb in under 3 minutes, fast enough to prevent the patient from bleeding to death, slow enough to ensure maximum agony. They developed techniques passed down through generations, trade secrets whispered from master to apprentice like recipes for perfectly prepared suffering. The post-operative care was where their delusions reached peak insanity. They would pack the wound with honey, wine, or sometimes just dirty rags, believing that pus formation was a healthy sign of healing. What we now know as infection, they celebrated as progress. Patients who developed gangrene were simply candidates for further amputation, creating a grotesque assembly line of human reduction. But amputations were just the beginning of their surgical repertoire. These men also performed trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits or excess pressure. Imagine lying on a wooden table while your neighborhood barber positions a hand-cranked drill against your temple. The grinding sound of metal against bone, the spray of blood and brain matter, all performed with the casual confidence of someone who did this every Tuesday afternoon. The tools for trepanation were particularly horrifying. Hand-forged drills with serrated edges that would tear through scalp and skull with equal brutality. No depth gauges, no understanding of brain anatomy. Just keep drilling until something interesting happened. Sometimes patients survived, sometimes they didn't, but William always learned something valuable for the next procedure. Their obsession with bloodletting reached truly artistic levels of sophistication. They developed charts showing which veins to open for specific ailments, created elaborate schedules based on lunar cycles and zodiac signs, and even designed special chairs with armrests positioned for optimal blood drainage. It was systematic vampirism disguised as healthcare. The cupping therapy they practiced would make modern torture specialists impressed. They would place heated glass cups on the skin, creating suction that pulled blood to the surface, then slice the raised flesh with razor-sharp scarificators. The geometric patterns of cuts were almost decorative, turning human backs into bloody works of abstract art. Patients would leave looking like they'd been mauled by a very precise wild animal. But perhaps their most disturbing specialty was dental surgery. Remember, these were the same hands that had been elbow-deep in someone's gangrenous leg wound earlier that morning. No gloves, no sterilization, just reach into that mouth with whatever tools seemed appropriate. Pliers designed for pulling horseshoe nails, knives sharpened on leather strops, and the gentle bedside manner of someone who viewed your jaw as just another mechanical problem to solve. Tooth extraction was performance art. The patient would be held down by apprentices while the barber surgeon worked his iron pliers around the affected tooth. No Novocaine, no understanding of nerve pain, just raw strength against bone and root. The sound of a tooth being torn from its socket, that wet, cracking noise, became as familiar in their shops as the snip of scissors through hair. They even developed specialized torture devices for dental work. Spring-loaded pliers that could grip within human strength, lever systems that provided mechanical advantage for difficult extractions, and scraping tools designed to clean out infected sockets. Each innovation made the process more efficient and infinitely more agonizing. The social dynamics were equally twisted. These procedures weren't performed in private. They were public events. Friends and family would gather to watch, offering encouragement or fainting at the sight of blood. Children learned that this was normal, that human suffering was just another part of daily life in medieval society. The psychological conditioning required to perform these procedures daily is what fascinates me most. How does someone maintain the manual dexterity required for precise beard trimming after spending the morning sawing through human bone? The compartmentalization necessary suggests a level of emotional detachment that borders on sociopathy. Yet they weren't monsters. They were products of their time, shaped by a society that accepted pain as inevitable and saw no contradiction between healing and hurting. They genuinely cared about their patients' well-being, within the brutal constraints of medieval medical understanding, the road to hell paved with good intentions and sharp instruments. But this tradition of mixing grooming with surgery didn't fade quietly into history. The next time you feel that hot towel on your face, that gentle scrape of a razor against your throat, remember William of Canterbury and his bloody workshop. Remember how easily care becomes harm when we stop questioning the hands we trust with our most vulnerable moments. Let me tell you about the guild system that legitimized this madness, because understanding how society organized and celebrated these practices reveals something truly chilling about human nature. We didn't just tolerate the Barber-Surgeons, we institutionalized them, gave them official recognition, and turned their brutality into a respected profession. The Worshipful Company of Barbers was established in London in 1308, followed by the Guild of Surgeons in 1368. Think about that for a moment. Two separate organizations, each dedicated to their own specialized form of human modification, eventually merging in 1540 to create the Company of Barber-Surgeons. It was like watching torture and grooming officially shake hands and agree to share customers. These weren't underground operations hidden from authority. They were government-sanctioned mutilation factories with royal charters and official seals. King Henry VIII himself granted them the right to dissect 4 executed criminals per year for educational purposes. Imagine the bureaucratic meetings where they discussed the optimal number of corpses needed for proper apprentice training. The guild structure created something even more disturbing than individual butchery. It created systematic, standardized butchery. Apprentices learned identical techniques, masters shared best practices for human disassembly, and the entire profession developed quality control standards for pain infliction. They turned suffering into a science with reproducible results. Guild examinations were particularly twisted affairs. Candidates would demonstrate their skills on live patients while masters observed and critiqued their technique. Picture young Thomas, nervously preparing for his barber-surgeon certification, knowing that his career depended on how cleanly he could amputate a beggar's infected leg, while a panel of experts took notes on his form. The social hierarchy within these guilds reveals the true depths of medieval medical delusion. Master barber-surgeons held the same social status as wealthy merchants, owned property, and were respected members of their communities. They weren't seen as necessary evils. They were seen as pillars of society, men whose skills kept civilization functioning. Their shops became gathering places for the intellectual elite. Scholars would visit to discuss the latest theories about bodily humors. Priests would debate the theological implications of bloodletting, and wealthy patrons would commission custom surgical procedures like they were ordering tailored clothing. The normalization of brutality reached such heights that torture became fashionable. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. These guilds didn't just practice medicine, they controlled it. They held monopolies on surgical procedures, charged premium prices for their services, and actively suppressed alternative healing methods. Anyone caught practicing surgery without guild membership faced imprisonment, or worse. They weaponized human desperation into a business model. The economic incentives were perversely perfect. Wealthy patients paid premium prices for complex procedures, while the poor received basic services that often required multiple follow-up visits. A single infection could generate months of billable hours as the barber-surgeon fought the very problems his initial incompetence had created. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of profitable suffering. Their record-keeping was meticulous in its horror. Guild ledgers from the 15th century detail thousands of procedures with clinical precision. Patient John Cobbler, age 32, removed gangrenous arm, payment 4 shillings. Returned following a week for secondary infection treatment. Additional 2 shillings. Died of blood poisoning, full payment received prior to expiration. The training methods they developed would make modern educators weep. Apprentices spent years watching procedures before being allowed to hold instruments, then graduated to restraining patients, then to performing minor cuts and bleedings, and finally to full surgical procedures. It was a carefully structured progression from observer to executor of human misery. What haunts me most is their genuine pride in craftsmanship. These men took professional satisfaction in clean amputations, symmetrical bloodletting patterns, and efficient dental extractions. They competed with each other over speed and precision, turning human suffering into a sport with winners, losers, and admiring spectators. The guild halls themselves were monuments to institutionalized brutality. Walls decorated with surgical instruments like weapons and an armory, cabinets displaying preserved organs in glass jars, and examination tables stained with centuries of accumulated blood and other bodily fluids. These weren't medical facilities. They were museums of human disassembly. Their ceremonies and rituals added layers of pageantry to the horror. New guild members swore elaborate oaths promising to uphold the traditions of their craft. while masters performed demonstration surgeries during feast days. Imagine toasting the successful removal of a patient's kidney while the victim bled out on a table nearby, all sanctioned by church and state. The political power these guilds wielded was staggering. They influenced medical regulations, controlled access to surgical training, and even advised royalty on health matters. When King Edward IV suffered from persistent headaches, it was guild-certified barber-surgeons who recommended trepanation. The hole they drilled in his skull became infected, leading to his death and altering the course of English history. But perhaps most disturbing was their role in public executions. Guild members were officially responsible for the medical aspects of torture and execution, ensuring that condemned criminals suffered appropriately before dying. They developed techniques to maximize pain while preventing premature death, turning their healing knowledge into refined cruelty. The documentation they left behind reads like instruction manuals for systematic torture, step-by-step guides for breaking limbs, detailed anatomical charts showing optimal incision points, and careful notes on patient responses to various forms of induced trauma. They approached human suffering with the methodical precision of engineers solving technical problems. Their influence on medical terminology persists today. Words like surgery, barber, and bloodletting carry the linguistic DNA of these medieval practitioners. Every time we use these terms, we're speaking a language developed by men who saw no meaningful distinction between grooming and mutilation. The guild system created something unprecedented in human history, the professionalization of institutionalized torture disguised as healthcare. They took individual sadism and transformed it into organized, socially acceptable brutality with government approval and religious blessing. But the systematic legitimization of suffering didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. The next time you see professional medical associations, licensing boards, and standardized procedures, remember the Guild of Barber-Surgeons. Remember how easily institutions can transform individual cruelty into collective respectability, how quickly society can normalize the abnormal when it serves economic and political interests. Now let me introduce you to the customers, because understanding who sought out these services reveals the most disturbing truth of all. We were willing participants in our own systematic destruction. The barber-surgeons didn't force their services on unwilling victims. People lined up, paid good money, and returned for more punishment, convinced they were receiving the finest medical care available. Meet Margaret the baker's wife, living in 1456, Canterbury. She's been feeling melancholy lately, what we might recognize today as depression following the death of her infant son. But Margaret doesn't understand grief psychology. She knows only what the church and medical authorities tell her. She has an excess of black bile that must be drained from her system. So Margaret voluntarily walks into William's shop, pays him 2 months' wages, and lies down on his blood-stained table. She watches him heat the cupping glasses over an open flame, feels the searing pain as he places them on her back, and experiences the agony as he slices through the raised flesh with his scarificator. She believes this torture will cure her sadness. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. Margaret feels better afterward. Not because the procedure worked, but because the physical trauma temporarily overwhelmed her emotional pain, and the community support she received as a medical patient gave her the human connection she desperately needed. The barber surgeon became accidentally successful through pure psychological manipulation. The customer demographics reveal a cross-section of medieval desperation. Wealthy merchants seeking fashionable bloodletting treatments, soldiers requiring battlefield amputations, pregnant women convinced that bleeding would ensure healthy births, and elderly nobles desperate to drain away the corrupt humors of aging. Each demographic had its own specialized torture menu. Wealthy customers didn't just buy procedures, they bought experiences. Private chambers with silk-covered tables, assistants trained in conversation to distract from the pain, and custom-designed instruments engraved with family crests. They turned mutilation into luxury consumption, proving that enough money can make any horror seem civilized. The repeat customer phenomenon was particularly twisted. People who survived initial procedures often returned for maintenance treatments, seasonal adjustments, and preventive care. They developed relationships with their barber-surgeons, trusted them with family medical decisions, and even included them in their wills. Stockholm Syndrome disguised as healthcare loyalty. Consider the case of Lord Edmund the Pious, a regular customer who visited his barber surgeon monthly for prophylactic bloodletting. Over 15 years, he had approximately 12 gallons of blood drained from his body, enough to kill him several times over if done at once, but administered gradually to maximize both suffering and profit. He died convinced he had received the finest medical care money could buy. The social pressure to seek these treatments was enormous. Refusing barber-surgeon services marked someone as either too poor to afford proper health care or too ignorant to understand medical necessity. Wives pressured husbands to get their humors balanced, parents brought children for preventive treatments, and communities shunned those who relied on folk remedies instead of professional medical torture. The testimonial culture they created was masterfully manipulative. Satisfied customers would publicly praise their barber-surgeons, describing miraculous cures and recommending specific practitioners to friends and family. These weren't paid endorsements. They were genuine expressions of gratitude from people who had been systematically brutalized and convinced it was beneficial. The seasonal treatment cycles reveal the depth of customer indoctrination. Spring bloodletting to purge winter's accumulated toxins. Summer scarification to prevent heat-related illnesses. Autumn trepanation to prepare for seasonal melancholy. And winter amputations to remove frostbitten extremities. They created year-round demand for systematic mutilation. Women faced particularly horrific specialized treatments. Menstruation was considered a natural bloodletting process that sometimes required assistance through artificial bleeding. Pregnancy brought recommendations for regular blood drainage to prevent the baby from growing too large. Childbirth complications were treated with immediate amputation of affected body parts. Every aspect of female biology became a justification for profitable torture. Children weren't spared from this systematic abuse. Parents brought infants for preventive bloodletting, toddlers for humoral balancing, and teenagers for character-building procedures designed to drain away rebellious spirits. The normalization of childhood suffering ensured that each generation accepted these practices as natural and necessary. The referral networks they developed were sophisticated business operations. Barber-Surgeons maintained relationships with priests who would recommend treatments for spiritual ailments, with merchants who identified customers showing signs of wealth-related health problems, and with other guild members who would refer cases requiring specialized brutality. Customer education became a crucial part of their business model. They taught people to recognize symptoms that required professional intervention, explained the theoretical basis for their treatments, and provided detailed post-procedure care instructions. They transformed ignorant patients into educated consumers of their own systematic destruction. The payment systems reveal the true desperation of their customers. People mortgaged property, sold family heirlooms, and borrowed money at usurious rates to afford barber-surgeon services. Some traded labor for treatments, working in the shops as assistants while recovering from their own procedures. The economic exploitation was as systematic as the physical brutality. The most chilling aspect was the family involvement in treatment decisions. Husbands would authorize procedures for their wives, parents would schedule treatments for their children, and adult children would arrange care for elderly parents. Love became indistinguishable from abuse when filtered through medieval medical understanding. The success stories they publicized were carefully curated propaganda. They highlighted patients who survived dramatic procedures while ignoring the majority who died from complications. They attributed natural healing to their interventions and blamed treatment failures on patient noncompliance or divine intervention. The narrative manipulation was as sophisticated as their surgical techniques. But perhaps most disturbing was the genuine affection many customers developed for their barber surgeons. These relationships weren't just professional. They became deeply personal bonds forged through shared suffering. Patients would request specific practitioners, bring gifts during holidays, and even name their children after the men who had systematically tortured them. The customer loyalty programs they developed would impress modern marketers. Regular patients received discounts on procedures, priority scheduling during busy seasons, and access to experimental treatments. They created VIP tiers of torture with membership benefits that encouraged continued participation in their own systematic destruction. But this tradition of voluntary participation in medical brutality didn't end with the Middle Ages. The next time you eagerly schedule a medical procedure, trust a professional's recommendation without question, or pay premium prices for treatments you don't understand, remember Margaret, the baker's wife, walking voluntarily into William's shop. Remember how easily we become willing participants in our own systematic destruction when it's dressed in the language of care and healing. But the true horror story isn't in what they did, it's in how they justified it. Because understanding the elaborate philosophical and theological frameworks they constructed to legitimize systematic torture reveals something terrifying about human nature. Our infinite capacity to rationalize cruelty when it serves our purposes. The theoretical foundation for barber-surgeon practices rested on the ancient doctrine of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This wasn't some primitive superstition. It was sophisticated medical theory endorsed by the greatest minds of classical antiquity, refined by Islamic scholars and blessed by Christian theologians. When Hippocrates himself advocated bloodletting, who was a medieval barber to question such authority? Picture the intellectual gymnastics required to transform systematic mutilation into healing philosophy. Every symptom became evidence of humoral imbalance. Every successful torture session proved the theory's validity, and every patient death was attributed to treatment delays rather than treatment brutality. They created an unfalsifiable belief system where failure only strengthened faith in the method. The astrological components added layers of pseudoscientific legitimacy to their butchery. They calculated optimal bloodletting dates based on lunar cycles, chose amputation timing according to planetary alignments, and prescribed specific procedures during particular zodiacal periods. The stars themselves became accomplices in systematic human destruction, lending cosmic authority to earthly torture. Church doctrine provided the ultimate seal of approval for their practices. If God created the human body with specific humoral balances, then restoring those balances through bloodletting and surgery was essentially divine work. The Barber-Surgeons weren't just healers. They were instruments of God's will, correcting the physical manifestations of spiritual corruption through holy violence. The scholarly apparatus they constructed was impressively elaborate. Universities taught humoral theory as established medical fact. Scholars wrote detailed treatises on optimal bleeding techniques, and philosophers debated the ethical implications of various surgical procedures. The intellectual establishment transformed systematic torture into academic respectability through sheer volume of theoretical justification. But here's where the rationalization reaches truly disturbing heights. They developed detailed explanations for why their treatments caused so much pain. Suffering wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was proof that the treatment was working. The more agony a patient experienced, the more corrupt humors were being expelled from their system. Pain became evidence of healing rather than harm. The diagnostic methods they created were masterpieces of confirmation bias. They examined urine color, studied stool consistency, measured pulse variations, and interpreted dreams to determine humoral imbalances. Every possible symptom could be explained through their theoretical framework, and every explanation led inevitably to the same solution: more bloodletting, more surgery, more systematic brutality disguised as medicine. The case studies they documented read like torture manuals disguised as medical journals. Patient exhibited excessive sanguine temperament, treated with arterial bleeding until fainting occurred, followed by scarification of the back, resulting in balanced humoral state and improved disposition. They turned human suffering into clinical success stories through careful narrative construction. Their training materials were equally sophisticated in their horror. Apprentice barber-surgeons studied detailed anatomical charts showing optimal incision points, memorized tables correlating symptoms with specific bleeding procedures, and practiced surgical techniques on condemned criminals. They created comprehensive educational systems for systematic human destruction. The peer review process they established would make modern academics proud. Guild members regularly observed each other's procedures, offered constructive criticism on technique, and shared innovations in torture methodology. They built professional communities dedicated to continuous improvement in the art of legitimized brutality. The economic theories underlying their practice were particularly twisted. They calculated the optimal amount of blood to drain based on patients' social class, with wealthy customers receiving more extensive treatments to justify higher fees. They developed sliding scales of suffering that correlated directly with ability to pay, turning human agony into a luxury commodity. The legal frameworks supporting their work were comprehensive and sophisticated. Courts recognized barber-surgeon testimony as expert medical opinion. Laws protected their monopoly on surgical procedures, and regulations standardized their torture techniques across jurisdictions. The entire legal system became complicit in institutionalized brutality through official recognition and protection. The theological justifications they developed were particularly elaborate. They argued that human suffering was inherently redemptive, that physical pain purified the soul, and that medical procedures were forms of penance that brought patients closer to God. They transformed torture into sacrament through careful theological reasoning. The philosophical frameworks they constructed addressed every possible ethical objection to their practices. If patients died, it proved God's will superseded human intervention. If patients survived, it demonstrated the effectiveness of their treatments. If patients suffered, it showed the necessary process of humoral rebalancing. They created logical systems that made systematic torture seem not just acceptable, but morally imperative. The scientific method they claimed to follow was a masterpiece of selective evidence gathering. They recorded successful procedures while ignoring failures, attributed positive outcomes to their interventions while blaming negative results on external factors, and cited classical authorities while dismissing contemporary critics. They built impressive facades of empirical rigor around foundations of systematic delusion. The documentation they produced was voluminous and convincing to contemporary readers. Detailed case histories, statistical analyses of treatment outcomes, and theoretical treatises on humoral medicine filled libraries across Europe. They created an entire literature of legitimized torture disguised as medical scholarship. The international networks they established shared knowledge and techniques across political boundaries. Italian innovations in amputation reached English practitioners. French developments in bloodletting influenced German procedures, and Spanish advances in trepanation spread throughout medieval Europe. They created global communities of practice dedicated to systematic human destruction. The quality control systems they implemented were impressively thorough. Guild inspectors evaluated technique, standardized procedures, ensured consistent results, and certification processes guaranteed minimum competency in torture methodology. They applied the same attention to detail and systematic brutality that other crafts applied to pottery or textiles. The research and development they conducted pushed the boundaries of human suffering with methodical precision. They experimented with new bleeding techniques, tested innovative amputation methods, and developed novel approaches to surgical torture. Their commitment to continuous improvement and systematic brutality rivaled that of any legitimate medical advancement, but perhaps most chilling was their genuine belief in the righteousness of their cause. These weren't cynical opportunists exploiting human desperation. They were true believers, convinced they were serving humanity's highest good. They slept peacefully after days spent systematically torturing fellow human beings, secure in the knowledge that they were instruments of healing and divine will. But this elaborate apparatus of rationalization and justification didn't disappear with medieval medicine. The next time you hear complex explanations for questionable treatments, see impressive credentials used to justify harmful procedures, or witness suffering explained away as necessary for healing, remember the theological and philosophical frameworks that legitimized barber-surgeon practices. Remember how easily sophisticated reasoning can transform systematic cruelty into moral imperative when it serves the interests of those in power. Now, let me tell you how this all ended, or rather, how it transformed into something even more insidious. Because the decline of barber-surgeons wasn't a triumph of enlightenment over barbarism. It was the evolution of systematic brutality into forms so sophisticated that we still practice them today without recognizing their medieval DNA. The beginning of the end came not from moral awakening, but from economic competition. As universities began training physicians in more profitable procedures, the medical establishment started viewing barber-surgeons as threats to their monopoly rather than allies in healing. The same institutional thinking that once legitimized their practices now demanded their elimination, not because the brutality was wrong, but because it was no longer economically convenient. The year 1745 marked the official separation of barbers and surgeons in England, but this wasn't medical progress, it was professional rebranding. The surgeons simply shed their association with haircutting while maintaining all their expertise in human butchery. They traded their striped poles for white coats, their guild halls for hospitals, and their apprentices for medical students. The torture continued under new management. Watch how seamlessly they transformed their image. The same hands that had sawed through bone without anesthesia suddenly became surgical pioneers. The same minds that had drained blood based on lunar cycles became medical researchers. The same institutions that had legitimized systematic torture became centers of healing. Now, they didn't abandon their practices, they simply found better marketing strategies. The transition period reveals the true depths of their adaptability. Many barber-surgeons simply renamed themselves surgeons and continued operating exactly as before, while others maintained dual practices, cutting hair in the morning and removing limbs in the afternoon. The institutional memory of systematic brutality persisted even as the professional terminology evolved. The instruments they passed down to modern surgery carry the DNA of medieval torture devices. Today's scalpels evolved from their razors, modern forceps from their extraction tools, and surgical saws from their amputation equipment. Every operating theater contains the refined descendants of medieval torture chambers, disguised by chrome plating and sterilization protocol. But here's what makes my blood run cold. The psychological conditioning they perfected didn't disappear with their guild system. Modern medical training still requires students to overcome natural empathy responses, to view human suffering as necessary for healing, and to maintain emotional detachment while inflicting pain on conscious patients. The same mental programming, refined over centuries of practice. The hierarchy they established persists in every modern hospital. Attending physicians occupy the same social position as master barber-surgeons, residents serve as their apprentices, and medical students perform the same observational roles as medieval guild apprentices. The power structures remain identical, just dressed in contemporary professional language. Their monopolistic practices found new expression in medical licensing boards, pharmaceutical patents, and hospital privileges. The same exclusionary tactics once used to prevent unlicensed healing now protect modern medical establishments from alternative practitioners. They weaponized legitimacy then, and they weaponize it now. Just with better lawyers and public relations, the customer psychology they exploited remains unchanged. Modern patients still voluntarily submit to procedures they don't understand, pay enormous sums for treatments that cause suffering, and develop loyal relationships with practitioners who systematically brutalize them. We've simply industrialized the Stockholm Syndrome they pioneered in medieval shops. Consider the modern cancer treatment protocols that pump poison into patients' bodies, burn their tissue with radiation, and surgically remove organs, all while charging premium prices and promising miraculous cures. The methodologies have improved, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Systematic brutality disguised as healing, delivered by respected professionals with impressive credentials. The documentation practices they pioneered evolved into modern medical record systems. Every procedure is carefully cataloged, every patient response meticulously tracked, and every outcome statistically analyzed. They built comprehensive databases of human suffering disguised as quality improvement initiatives, just as their medieval predecessors maintained guild records of successful torture sessions. The insurance systems that fund modern healthcare mirror the payment structures of medieval guilds. Wealthy patients receive premium treatments in private facilities, while the poor endure standardized brutality in public institutions. The correlation between economic status and quality of suffering remains as precise as it was in 1400. Just administered through more sophisticated financial mechanisms. The pharmaceutical industry they spawned represents the ultimate evolution of their practices. Instead of draining blood based on humoral theory, We now consume chemicals based on neurotransmitter hypotheses. Instead of individual barber-surgeons profiting from local suffering, we have global corporations extracting wealth from systematic medicalization of human experience. The research methodologies they developed to justify their practices became the foundation of modern clinical trials. The same selective evidence gathering, the same confirmation bias, the same tendency to attribute positive outcomes to interventions while blaming negative results on patient characteristics. The scientific method became a more sophisticated tool for legitimizing systematic brutality. Their expansion into childhood treatments evolved into modern pediatric medicine, where children still submit to painful procedures they cannot understand or consent to, administered by adults who claim superior knowledge about their bodily needs. The power dynamics remain identical, just protected by additional layers of legal and ethical frameworks. The mental health applications they pioneered transformed into modern psychiatry, where practitioners still drain patients' emotional and financial resources through repetitive procedures designed to adjust internal balances. The humoral theory became neurotransmitter theory, but the fundamental approach, identifying internal imbalances and correcting them through external intervention, remains unchanged. The cosmetic applications of their work evolved into modern plastic surgery, where practitioners still modify human bodies based on aesthetic theories, still charge premium prices for voluntary mutilation, and still convince patients that suffering is necessary for improvement. The vanity that once drove bloodletting now drives liposuction, but the psychology remains identical. But perhaps most disturbing is how they trained us to police ourselves. Modern patients research symptoms online, self-diagnose conditions, and actively seek out treatments that previous generations would have recognized as torture. We've internalized their customer education so completely that we now generate demand for our own systematic brutalization without requiring external pressure. The professional conferences where modern practitioners share innovations in human modification serve the same function as medieval guild meetings where barber-surgeons demonstrated new torture techniques. The terminology changed from bloodletting innovations to minimally invasive procedures, but the fundamental purpose, refining methods of profitable human modification, remains unchanged. The certification processes that validate modern medical practitioners follow the same patterns established by medieval guilds. Lengthy apprenticeships under master practitioners, examinations that test technical competency in human modification, and ongoing education requirements that ensure adherence to institutional standards. The systematic training of systematic brutality continues under contemporary professional development programs. But this evolution of medieval torture into modern medicine isn't some conspiracy. It's simply the natural progression of human institutions that discovered profitable ways to monetize suffering. The barber-surgeons didn't disappear. They just learned to hide their medieval hearts behind contemporary credentials. So the next time you enter a medical facility, see those familiar red and white symbols, and place your trust in professionals wielding sharp instruments near your most vulnerable places. Remember that you're participating in an unbroken tradition stretching back to medieval guild halls. The tools are shinier, the justifications more sophisticated, and the profit margins higher, but the fundamental relationship between practitioner and patient remains exactly what it was when William the barber-surgeon first hung his pole outside that Canterbury shop. We never escaped the Middle Ages. We just learned to dress our medieval impulses in contemporary clothing and somehow convinced ourselves that makes us civilized.